want to educate ourselves, educate the community on PTSD. You have a lot of the vendors out there right now. I think understanding what symptoms are, being able to identify those symptoms, being able to know where to refer them to is a big part of the key, is identifying them, knowing how to ask the right questions, and then send them to the right people. So with that being said, I would like to introduce you to our next presenter, Dr. Eleanor Covan. She is a professor emerita of gerontology and sociology at the University of North Carolina in Wilmington, and she's the editor-in-chief of the scholarly journal Healthcare for Women International. In both roles, she encourages others to conduct research which makes a difference specifically about caregiving relationships. Her recent research has been about the impact of combat on aging, particularly in the context of the family. This work was inspired by devotion to her husband, Edward, who completed 2.5 tours in Vietnam, and his PTSD therapy brothers. So let's give a round of applause for Dr. Covan.
Pushed it on. Okay, I want you to note his age and note mine, because the punchline of my talk is really that the psychological symptoms of PTSD that you've heard so much about have been fairly constant across cohorts of military veterans. And when someone has PTSD and has those kinds of behaviors and symptoms, they have an effect on the family. But what happens with PTSD and its impact on the family changes tremendously, depending on where we are in history and what else is happening at the same time. And you heard the other two presenters say this kind of thing, but I'm going to say a lot more about it because my background is different than theirs. So, how I know what I know is, yes, I'm married to a Vietnam veteran. It's not my first marriage. It's not his. I'm part of the recycled marriage cohort of Vietnam vets, and I know a lot. I've been married to my husband Edward for 21.5 years, and relatively speaking, it's a good marriage. But it has ups and downs because he has PTSD, and he married a wife who'd had her own trauma before he met me. So we both come into this relationship with baggage. In addition, yes, I'm a professor emeritus. That means I'm a retired professor at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington. I went to school at Temple University in Philadelphia, and I was in college when Ed was in Vietnam. And I was what, for many of you in this room, particularly people of the Vietnam veterans, I was your worst nemesis. I was against the war when you were fighting it. I'm not now. I'm a very different person because as time goes by, we learn and we share and we recover and we're resilient. And Ed and I have pretty similar political values now, but we won't go into them. The point is we learn by experience, and part of my experience includes having done a lot of research with veterans, in particular Vietnam veterans. And these folks with whom I worked, I won't say I studied them. I didn't study them. We shared our souls. This work was very, very important to me and still is. In fact, I'd always dedicate the presentations that I give to the memory of 3 of these guys because they're no longer with us. And I just want you to know that the work I do is heartfelt. And it's heartfelt because every one of the people who shared his soul with me, all the Vietnam vets that I worked with happened to be male, although I interviewed women who were in service too and who were nurses. All of them had PTSD who were participating in working with me, and all of them said that what was going on with them had tremendous impact on their families. Very few of them seemed to recognize that a lot of the women they married had tremendous impact on them too, until much later. So my view is really not that different from what you've heard. I believe that combat is trauma. It's one kind of trauma, but there are other kinds of trauma as well that come from being, surviving perhaps a natural disaster, or surviving sexual assault, or witnessing a murder that had absolutely nothing to do with you. There are lots of things. But the people who I cite in my research are Eva and Boaz Kahana. The reason I cite them is that they're gerontologists. And like me, they look at not just PTSD as an illness or stress that occurs as a consequence of trauma, but they look at how this stress that occurs as a consequence of trauma changes over the course of a life cycle. So I know a fairly large amount about how combat-related stress affects Vietnam veterans, and so do you. I mean, many of you are Vietnam veterans, but one of the reasons you know a lot is that Vietnam veterans are now in their late 60s and early 70s, and they've lived a lot of their lives. So we've got a lot of data out there. We know. We know less about the whole life course of OIF veterans and OEF veterans because they haven't lived long enough. We know their psychological symptoms are occurring very much like Vietnam vets. But we have no reason to think that it'll be exactly the same. In fact, we know it won't be because the social response to PTSD is different. We know that Vietnam vets experienced combat-related stress, and we know that Korean vets experienced it. We know that Native American tribes have experienced it. But because they didn't have the same label and the same term, the experience was very different for the family. As you heard, it's spoken. If you have a Native American ritual to honor warriors and you have a powwow and people dance and people sing and people make a big positive deal about it, the response and support that you're going to have from your community is really different. And that response includes the response of the spouse and the children, but they're all part of it. Everybody is affected, but in different ways. We say that World War II veterans had the same thing, but they didn't exactly have the same thing because they came home and there were so many more of them that it was would have been hard to go anywhere if you were a male, who had participated in a war between 1942 and 1945 and not meet another male who had also done that. It was not the case for Vietnam vets. I mean, they came home to being, to being, if they weren't spit on themselves, to seeing things on the news that weren't really very good. Anyway, I have a bunch of assumptions, and I hate to talk about theory when you want to know about family and what actually happens, but I think it's going to help you to understand, the kinds of assumptions I have. I am a gerontologist, which means I study the whole life course. I study it from birth to death. I think life begins no later than birth, and probably before, because before you're ever born, people are anticipating your birth. Some of them are. And I have this life course perspective that says things are going to change. So you heard the other presenters say that things get worse, there can be a crisis, and there's crises of old age. And you're going to hear me say right now that we don't even know what happens with PTSD across the life course, because right now, people are just trying to tease out when people are 65, 66, 67, 70, 72, 73, whether when someone starts to behave a little strangely, whether they may have early onset Alzheimer's or whether they're, they can't tell the difference exactly between some symptoms of PTSD and some symptoms of dementia. And some people say, well, what difference does it make? We're going to throw people in nursing homes that way, at that point anyway, or we're going to give them family aid and assistance. But it does make a difference. We don't know. And as has been the case all through their life course as veterans, as combat veterans, Vietnam veterans are going to teach us a whole lot about what happens to PTSD across the life course, because they are the first cohort of veterans who are going to have enough people surviving to take a look at this, but we don't know yet, and I think it's important to say this. And you'll hear me argue, because I am a gerontologist, that we're starting to do things for families, and there are some family support groups, but there's very little in the way of family support for people who are dealing with both PTSD and Alzheimer's disease. You know, and often when people have dementia, they express symptoms of anger and isolation too. So when does one become the other? You know, I mean, you know, to a sociologist, the answer is really kind of different. So this matters. I'm also a symbolic interactionist, which means I don't believe that psychological symptoms occur in a vacuum, and we tend to look at and treat individuals, and we're all sort of yelling and cheering on when we finally begin to consider the family. And the family is just one social institution. If we're going to treat PTSD and look at the impact on the family, it's probably not the individual and the family who need treatment. In my opinion, and I'm not very humble about it, it's the society that needs treatment. If we want to cure PTSD, we have to cure war. We really do have to put weapons into plowshares. But that's a tall order, because one of the things that the veterans that I interact with have taught me is that freedom really isn't free, and there's a reason why there are some weapons and that people fight the honest fight. But PTSD occurs within social institutions, one of which is the military, one of which is the family, one of which is the educational institution, one of which is the economic institution, and one of which is the political institution, which is perhaps the most screwed up one we've got right now in this country. So I mean, you need to know that these are my my assumptions. Like the previous speakers, I do believe in a family system model, particularly with regard to therapy. I do believe that what happens to one member of a family affects everyone else, but it affects them very differently, and I'll explain why in a minute. In my gerontological life course perspective, we gerontologists are a really arrogant bunch. We believe that if we know something about 4 clusters of variables, we can predict what's going to happen to people in old age, and will happen in the course of their life, even if they have PTSD. Because PTSD, at some point, becomes a label. It becomes a personal attribute that is given to you by other people with whom you interact. But we believe that how you experience this PTSD is going to have a lot to do with what cohort you're in. A cohort is just a group of people. And most of us are familiar with age cohorts. So people who went to Vietnam were disproportionately baby boomers. There were some Vietnam vets who were a little older. There were some people who served in World War II and Korea and Vietnam. But that wasn't the norm, as you heard other people say. Most Vietnam vets were in Vietnam when they were 18, 19, 20 years old. And we know that the years in which they were in Vietnam were very turbulent years in this country. And that affected everything about them. But when they were in Vietnam and when they came out, had a tremendous bearing too. So the cohort matters, an age cohort. It also matters who's in your cohort of people coming home. Period effects have to do with other things in history. I married my husband Ed in 1994, and yes, he's diagnosed with PTSD now. He hadn't been diagnosed yet in 1994, but his first thing he said to me was, "Hello, I'm a Vietnam vet," when he met me. And I didn't have a clue what that meant. I said, "Hi, I'm a professor." And I thought they were the same kind of thing. And maybe they were. But I didn't know then. The important thing that I'm going to get at, though, to tell you what a period effect is that after 9/11, all hell broke loose in my house. That became a trigger, because when my husband realized that we were at risk in his mind, and he was right on our own shore, when he realized that young men and young women, including one who was his niece, were about to embark on a battle similar to his, that just brought it all back. A period effect is something that affects all of us, but it will affect people with PTSD differently. simply because of their personal attribute. Stratification is not so relevant here, but stratification is dividing people up so that some have more and some have less access to resources. And some families have much more access to resources than others to get help. And you've heard people talk about, what kinds of programs and services are available to families for help. Well, there's a lot of wonderful, innovative programs. But the bottom line is most of those wonderful, innovative programs are not available to most families. You have to happen to be at the right place at the right time, and you can call that a crapshoot, or you can call that choice if you want to spend a lot of time picking the most ideal place to live for a military family now. I believe all these things matter. So when we can't just lump all families together, we have to look at which family, what they need, where they are. Oh. That's the good news. Because we define ourselves and who we are, and whether that's persons with PTSD or persons married to persons with PTSD or persons who are children of persons with PTSD or persons who are the parents of people with PTSD, these definitions come up in the context of institutions and in social interaction. If you want to change how PTSD affects the family, change the people with whom you interact. And I'm not saying that you should change your family. I'm just saying bring more people into your life, because you heard that you will get a different perspective if you enter therapy. You'll get a different perspective if you share your story at any point in time. And that can be positive because you don't have to be the same place you are now. Depressed today doesn't necessarily mean depressed tomorrow. And we already heard about the impact of labels, and I don't want to take the time. You see that I've got a slide up there, and it's not a very good slide, but it has baby boomers on the top and it has millennials on the bottom. And my cover slide said, the journey home is getting shorter for the family. And I'm arguing that the journey home is getting shorter and that PTSD is going to be experienced in a better way. And please don't misconstrue this as saying, you millennials have it made, you won't have a bad time with PTSD. I don't mean that. But what I do mean is that it's easier for later cohorts of veterans in a lot of ways simply because there's a lot more information available. When people came home from World War II and they came home from Korea and they came home from Vietnam, the social situation was different and there was no mental health diagnosis in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. There was no place you could go for help. There wasn't any internet invented yet. There wasn't any way you could get information other than to talk to your, another combat buddy, which is one of the reasons why I think people felt more comfortable talking to people who were like themselves, because there wasn't any other place to go. Now there is. And if you look at the two pictures, they're really grossly different. The top picture shows a bunch of teenagers who would have been the age cohort of those who went to Vietnam. The bottom shows the same age group in a very typical view. I mean, they're looking at their iPads and their iPhones and everything else. And they really represent different strategies of dealing with PTSD as well. One involves touching others and being together to get your information. The other involves looking on a phone or an iPad or somewhere else and sort of being tuned in and tuned out at the same time. But I want to make another point, and I want to make it quickly because I know I'm going to run out of time. When I give this talk, I usually have a lot more time. But when we talk about the information age, and we talk about the technological age, we have to talk about whether all this information is a good thing and whether it's good for people with PTSD. In my argument, the downside of being in a later cohort of people with PTSD is there's always been a divide between military families and non-military families. There's a sense in which the divide is even greater now. Is there anybody in this room who is not a reporter who is not in some way, shape, or form connected to a military family? Anybody? I mean, if to the extent there isn't, my point is being made. I mean, PTSD, and you heard Ray say, you heard Al say, you're hearing me say, it's really everybody's problem. It's our society's problem. But we have a town hall meeting on PTSD, and no one who is not in a military family even shows up. And how, then, can we really deal with the situation when we don't have the audience that we need? All this information is out there for millennials, and it's accessible to everybody. However, they're not looking. I mean, people who are looking on Facebook for a whole lot of other things, and they're sort of tuned in very much to themselves in a very myopic way. So one of the things that the reporter quoted in his interview of me was that, we just have Memorial Day, and people thank military families and veterans for their service, but they don't have any idea at all of what that service is. They don't know about PTSD, they don't know how it affects the family, and maybe if you're an elementary school teacher, you think you know because you've got a kid in your classroom whose mother or father has been in the war. But most people don't know anything. In preparation for this, I went around and randomly asked people in a shopping mall whether they knew what the letters OIF or OEF meant. And almost no one could tell me. And guess what? The people who could tell me were connected with military families. That's pretty bad, isn't it? I think it's pretty bad. So we have all this information out there. But when we thank people for our service, we're really thanking them for allowing us to be in ignorant bliss. And I mention this because I told you I was your worst nightmare in 1967, 68, 69, and 70. But remember, I was on the other side of the divide. I didn't know anybody in a military family. I had no knowledge of what it is I was against. I was just against people dying. So I'm going to skip that slide except to let you know that the experience of PTSD and the experience of deployment is tough on families for a reason that should be pretty obvious. If you're deployed and you're somewhere else, even if you're working and you're somewhere else. I had dinner with some friends last night whose son is about to have a job on a cruise ship. Not at all like the military, but what's going to happen is he's going to work for a cruise line, and he's going to be sent traveling more than he's home. And he's going to be away for periods of 6 months at a time because he's going to work for the cruise line going from one location to another, to another, to another. When you're separated from what's going on at home and you're in some kind of artificial world, artificial compared to what people are experiencing here, there's going to be stress on the family because you're not going to be sharing things. But it's different because when people were in Vietnam in 1968, they might have worried about the Tet Offensive. What were we worrying about at home? We were worrying about people being assassinated. We were worrying about if we were in the same age group, who we were going to have sex with, or where the latest ounce of pot was going to come from. It was a very different period of time. And in 1973, when people in Vietnam were worried about Jane Fonda and labeling her Hanoi Jane, many of the rest of us were worrying about whether Roe versus Wade was going to be passed or not. Very different set of issues, very different set of circumstances, and when you bring people home and you're trying to get them to talk about what's real and what's important really is different, of course. Good news, though, is that when you start thinking about how information is transferred, the reason I'm arguing that it's a little potentially better for families now is that information allows for more communication. In Vietnam, if you sent a letter home, first of all, it might not ever get delivered, and it might be, what was in it wasn't going to be really relevant anyway. And I'm not saying that people who went to Afghanistan or went to Iraq or who went to the Gulf War were saying anything real about combat either, but with the information age, it's possible that you could be communicating with somebody on Skype and you can actually hear combat. You can actually hear something blow up. And you can hear more and see it without really looking very hard. So if you're a wife or you're the mother of somebody who is deployed and you've got a son or a daughter or a husband or a wife, for that matter, who isn't telling you something, there are lots of sources of information where you can find things out. And therefore, you have a head start on building a relationship because you don't have to ask every other minute for information. Some things you can actually find out for yourself. So, where in Vietnam, people formed really volatile relationships. Everybody had volatile relationships in 1970. Everybody was trying to figure out whether to have a sexual revolution. And there were also, in that period of time, a lot of false reports or misunderstood reports in the press. And we had images of college campuses as absolutely terrible environments for veterans or anybody else, and college kids who really were gunned down on campus. And we had images of free love so that people coming back from Vietnam, if they came back at a particular time, if they went before the sexual revolution and came back right in the midst of it, I mean, they might have thought that everybody was in Woodstock swimming naked in the ponds, and that's not really the truth. And if you were here, you might have thought that everybody over in Vietnam, was a baby killer because that image was in the press, and it wasn't even Vietnam, Vietnam people who were serving in the U.S. military who were in that scene, but that particular scene was everywhere. So we had people coming home and traumatized again by how they were treated in the press and by everything they saw, and because it was difficult to get the communication. It's easier now. I mean, and it's still false now if you start looking at random pages on Facebook, but they're there. So, the Vietnam vets that I've been around describe their life in 5 stages, and they're as familiar as the rest of us with childhood and adolescence and adulthood and old age. But that's not the way they talk about their life. And by the way, they don't talk about themselves, or didn't start talking about themselves until maybe 2005, 2006, as people with PTSD. They talked about themselves kind of like Ray mentioned it. They talked about themselves as people who were in the military who had a lot of bad memories. I mean, they certainly didn't call themselves sick. But they divided their life into stages of before Vietnam, during Vietnam, and the wild men that they were when they came home, and some of them claim still to be. And others talk about a stage of reconnecting first with other veterans, and only then, really, building a decent relationship with their family. I understand, because I've read Ray's book and I've heard Alan talk, that not everybody has to reconnect with veterans organizations in order to feel a little better about controlling his or her life. But I can tell you that everybody who shared his story with me was in that kind of group. They were people who found it tremendously empowering and helpful to be around other veterans, particularly when they were first starting to get a handle on what was happening to them, and that it was a normal response rather than a crazy response. And if you live long enough, some Vietnam veterans told me they're fortunate to begin to understand the impact of combat, but that'll be a lifelong process of understanding. I have those stages up because they're not likely to be the stages of the next cohort of veterans. I don't necessarily think that everyone who comes back from Afghanistan and Iraq comes back as a wild man running, because one of the reasons for a wild man running is still the need for isolation, but people who were running earlier, not just from the war, but running from the press and running from hostile America, running from what they thought was an awful response. And I think that matters, and I think the fact that we have organizations like the VVA that say never again will one generation of veterans affect another is going to have a positive impact. And it is having a positive impact, and I don't just think it's lip service when Brandon thanked Vietnam veterans. I think Vietnam veterans have done a good job so far, and I think they'll continually do it until the last one's dead. I just believe it. This is the point in my presentation when I usually ask for volunteers. Do you have volunteers for me? No? Okay. Then I'm going to ask these 2 people here to be my volunteers. Would you be my volunteers? Yeah. Okay. I mean, I don't know whether you're a couple or not, but it won't matter for this. Okay. You might pretend you are, if you're not. But one of you is a veteran, right? Yes, of course. Well, the people who talk to me, your point is well taken, and they might indeed be phases rather than stages. But the people who spoke to me, to them it was important to call them stages because those who had passed out, moved beyond, particularly wild man running, really thought it was an accomplishment. So the if I tell you something about wild men running, you'll understand. I mean, those are the Harley days, those are the doping days, those are the risk-taking days. And there were a number of people who, keep in mind when I was doing the work with the people I was working with, they were approaching 60 years old. And they were finding it a little harder to do all the things they did when they were 20 and 30 and 40 and 50. So they said they're still running, but they're not wild now. And they considered it a stage. They were mixing life stage with chosen behavior. And they had some insight. So they were deciding to be less wild. And it may not fit everybody's situation, but that's what they said. And I think phase is probably a good amendment. I think that could be. But what I'm asking you to volunteer to do is I want the veteran to read the side on the left, and I want the partner at this moment to read the side on the right. And this isn't an ideal scenario. You'll find in your handout, that Dr. Scurfield has provided you with some guidelines for what partners and relatives probably could say that would be more effective than some of the stuff that's here. But this is a very, very typical dialogue that I think transcends cohorts of people where one goes to combat and comes back and would end up with a diagnosis of PTSD and would be trying to interact with a spouse, trying to get it together, and they're looking at it and starting from different vantage points. And it's more effective if it's read, so please.
War is hell, leave it there.
Home is where the heart is. Talk to me.
All those in combat understand.
I want to understand. Talk to me.
I need to get away. There's nowhere to run.
Run to me, not from me. Please, talk to me.
Part of my soul is with those who died.
I'm your soulmate. Talk to me.
Thank you for putting up with me.
Oh.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to generate that response, but I want to tell you that I've used the same dialogue in meeting after meeting after meeting, and it has the same emotional impact because it gets at the heart of where people are, and they don't realize it to start with. You have someone who cares so much and wants the attention and wants to be the soulmate and has the potential to be there and be really helpful. But you have someone who needs to get away and for whom talking about what went on is just absolutely not in the immediate scene of things. And particularly when people first try to reconnect, it's very, very difficult. So I have that in here so that you understand. Reconnecting with family is extremely complicated. You've heard other people say the same thing. With regard to Vietnam veterans, when people made an attempt to reconnect, they wanted to fit in. They wanted, Vietnam vets, one thing they did to hide was actually try not to hide. And one way you could fit in was to get married, even if you married the wrong person. If you were married, people would think you were normal. And the social response, not just from the wife, but from the community, was to cheer them on. People like weddings, and they like to think that relationships are good. And you could also try to fit in by participating in education, by going to church, by getting a job. So we talked about, people who became workaholics. If you got the right job and you were able to keep it for 30 or 40 years, boy, that was great, because you fit in and you might be suffering privately. And maybe you were sharing that with your wife, but you were fitting in and the rest of the community didn't bug you too much and didn't notice. So the spouse, a lot of times the spouses were put in a situation where they had to explain to the kids why dad was so angry, and that's still going on. Spouses very often struggle with PTSD because they feel they have to protect kids rather than try to explain anything about combat and what happens in combat to children. I'm of the opinion that you should explain a heck of a lot more to children than we do, rather than to shield them, because otherwise we repeat this generation after generation after generation. But there isn't a single response. Some people cheer on the veteran, some defend the veteran, some live in the shadows of the veteran. Some continue to beg for information. In the healthiest relationships, when veterans actually interact with other veterans and do things that are, that are gratifying and helping others, when the mate goes along and becomes part of a veterans organization, of an auxiliary and such, to an extent, at least there's a phase, I'll use phase rather than stage, in which the relationship builds and gets strengthened again. It's a good thing to do. I don't know if any of you ever look on the internet for things that are available for family support, but I would argue that today the wives of military veterans are at the stage that Vietnam veterans were at when they began to help themselves. There is a great number of organizations and websites that exist about military families helping one another. And in looking at these websites, I discovered the work of someone who has become a little bit of a hero to me, and one of the reasons, or a heroine to me, and one of the reasons that that's the case is that I was a university professor for so many years. Has anybody here ever heard of Shawn Gurley, G-O-U-R-L-E-Y? Well, she is about 30 years old, and she's just now in the process of earning her undergraduate degree. And she is the wife of a military veteran who came home with PTSD, and she's been trying to figure out what's happening. And she began by, on her own, looking at every website she could possibly look at. And she started her own website that's not just for spouses and not just for children, and it's for both husband and wife, because she believes that, everyone is telling her that it'll help her husband if she's supportive. And she kept asking, well, how the hell am I going to help him if somebody doesn't support me, because I don't know what to do? And she turned this into a research study in which she was looking for models of therapy and models of treatment that would specifically take the entire family into consideration. And she looked at existing models of treatment that were looking at how to help people in troubled relationships. And she came up with this research in which she's declared, and she's provided evidence, that educating spouses might be the key to helping veterans. And she asked the kind of question that a woman in the audience asked before. What's out there? What's out there? There are these weekends, but there's no consistent information. Only she asked the question even more specifically than you did. She wanted to know about treatment programs. And what she found was something that's called a Karpman drama triangle, and I think the therapists in this room probably know what that is. I didn't when I started out. But she has come up with a model of treatment for people with PTSD that examines relationships in terms of the key symptoms that people with PTSD have, on the one hand, and the key negative responses that trigger PTSD that spouses and family members have. And she created these triangles. So let's see if I can make this laser work. In the bottom part of the triangle, you have what is called chaos. And in the chaos triangle, she includes roles that get played interchangeably. She's got a victim, a savior, and a drill sergeant. And according to her, the drill sergeant represents the PTSD symptom of anger. The savior represents the unhealthy behavior of protecting the veteran from triggers. And the victim represents the spouse's negative view of PTSD symptoms. And that's, pretty much what she thinks that triangle is. But if you read her entire article, she says at some point in time, the savior is the spouse and the victim is the spouse, because these roles that people play change over time. If you are a spouse, and I'm speaking now as a spouse, and you've got a husband whom you love who's suffering, I think you're going to want to save him at some point in time. You're going to want to jump in and do something. But if you jump in and the water is deep and the water is turbulent, you're going to become a victim yourself, and you might be resentful because the symptoms aren't getting better and you really can't fix anything. And while you're the drill, and so they change roles, and then the person with PTSD tries to help the wife who's acting pretty crazy too. And then he may become a victim. So she's done a really good job with these roles. The roles aren't constant, but she does use the roles that come up with negative relationships. In this triangle here, she called it the loner triangle. And I kind of like the loner triangle too, because again, you could probably guess what symptoms of PTSD that's going to be. The isolator represents the PTSD symptom of avoidance. And she's got a bystander there who represents the PTSD symptom of lack of emotions, the person who is sort of bystander to life in everything that's going on. And the accommodator is the spouse's unhealthy behavioral accommodation of letting all that happen. And in her, the top triangle in any case is the potential healthy triangle, the model that she's suggesting, and she's not a therapist, she's just a wife, and I'm saying just a wife, but I'm saying it tongue-in-cheek because I think she's onto something. In the healthy triangle, you've got healthy roles. You've got a coach and a tester in which the spouses are working together, testing out what seems to work to strengthen their relationship, and they're actually talking about what seems to be triggering what in their relationship, and it's the therapist who is helping them do that. But of course, this woman is arguing, we need help with this as a team, as a family. And as long as we're treating the veteran only, we're not going to be able to be savior spouses. We're not going to be able to be anything other than people who are getting it wrong, although it does help to have a list of what you could and could not do, or should and should not do, even if it's imperfect. Oh, okay. This is a slide that describes the kinds of relationships that Vietnam vets told me they had. They had relationships with women that were based on sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And they had those relationships in particular if they were wild men running. But there were also very different kinds of relationships that were based on traditional sex roles. And I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but those of you who said you're still married, I would suspect more of you were trying to do it with the traditional roles than were trying to do it with the roles that were based on sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That's not to say if you lived through the decade of the 70s that you didn't inhale. I mean, Bill Clinton lied when he said that. But the point is, these relationships were really very different in kind, and a lot of which relationship you were in would have something to do with when you went to Vietnam. If you went earlier, you were more likely to be in a traditional relationship. If you went after 1971, you were more likely to be in the other, because you were more likely to have your first sexual experience before you went to Vietnam. If you were having your first sexual experience, afterwards, you were probably in a more traditional relationship, and you probably missed, and maybe even wonder what you missed about the sexual revolution. But that's not what the deal is now. Those aren't the big things in the news. What is in the news is what we can do about PTSD and what we're trying to do for veterans now that wasn't existing before. You heard about the advice to try to get connected with your spiritual self. We have a lot of therapies that are connected to, that are in some way like this. We know that nature fosters connections at a very deep level, the level of the soul. And we talk about having to, to deal with getting mind, body, and spirit back together if we're going to have healthy relationships. I found in the work that I do that taking it outside in a safe place is an ideal way to get relationships going again. The VA knows this. Most inpatient therapy programs have some element of nature and meditation and spirituality. They do it for a bunch of reasons. You don't have to be Christian, you don't have to be Jewish, you don't have to be a Muslim to feel the sense of something greater than you if you're outside. None of us created that, although we can ruin it. So therapies are working on that, and we've got a lot of them. I mean, you've already heard other people talk about them, but new therapies are emerging that introduce outdoor recreation. The fact that we have therapeutic recreation now is miraculous, and that's the other reason why I say it's a little bit easier for people who are in later cohorts to deal with PTSD than it was in the 70s and it was in the 80s when we were still arguing whether therapy was needed. We've got one program that's among my favorites that's right here in North Carolina. Is there anybody in this room that's participated in the Veterans Healing Farm? It's been profiled in the newspaper here in the Citizen Times. And this guy, whose name I believe is Mashi, had a vision that it would be useful to create a garden area, and he used with his family's permission. This is a case where family actually was provided the therapeutic environment. He used family land, and he created a healing space where veterans could come together and work the ground. In order to keep it going, his family, donated the land, but there still is a lot of materials that are needed to keep a garden going. So he's got community organizations involved making donations, and initially it was veterans only because it provided a safe haven for veterans to talk to one another. But then he began to invite the community in, and he began to have family weekends and family days, and now it's a program that is very effective, and I just think it's tremendous. If nature and spirituality isn't your thing, and we don't have very many young veteran spouses here, you might try something like this, but I don't quite recommend it. You've heard people say that we can't stress enough the importance of letting a spouse who's sick, if we're going to call PTSD a sickness, who's got a problem, that we're there for them, that we love them. But I don't think that these two images, the juxtaposition of a weapon over your head, even with loving messages all over your body, is a good idea, because when you mix the bedroom with images of war, one of the reasons that may backfire is that people with PTSD are very sensitive to people acting like they understand. And this is a spouse, I'll hold up this weapon, I understand what you went through, I'll be here. And it could backfire. I have a t-shirt that I designed for our local VVA chapter in Wilmington, and it has a map of Vietnam, and it says his fight was in Vietnam, and mine is with the Vietnam that's left in him. That says the same thing, but it acknowledges the fact that I know you're fighting and I'm fighting too. It's a little healthier than maybe a sexual scene. I don't know, maybe people are turned on by that. I don't like an image of sex and violence. I think it's dangerous. Here's an image I like better, and I like it better for a lot of reasons. This is an image that I pulled off the internet, and it's a blog that's available to anyone, but one wife happened to create a writing blog as she was watching her husband's progress through an inpatient PTSD program. And she has several photos and pictures before she got to this one in which she was documenting her husband's lack of emotional response and his withdrawal and everything else. And as she was trying to make sense out of what was happening to him, she read somewhere that dogs were good for PTSD. So what did she do? She went out and got them a puppy. And I say them because she was thinking of it as a member of the family. And this is her quote, on this particular slide. She's got others. I've heard the dogs help people with PTSD. And after seeing how John interacts with the puppy, I tend to believe it. And she had a series of pictures taken within a 15-minute framework in which finally John smiles. It's quite helpful. Dogs are very therapeutic. And anybody who's walked through the hall has seen this one. This is Covan's Ranger Rick, my husband's PTSD service dog. And he's wonderful, and the therapy is wonderful, but what I'm going to say is not only is the dog wonderful, the process of training the dog has been absolutely wonderful for my husband, for me, and for our son, who, just as a point in mentioning, has a diagnosis on the autism spectrum. Our household has 2 certified service dogs. This is Ed's dog. And we went through a long family meeting deciding whether both service dogs were going to be service dogs to the family or whether we were going to separate them. And it was very important to Ed that this dog be his dog. And he makes all the decisions about Ranger, and Ranger responds to him because that's what was therapeutic for him. The other service dog, and by the way, Ranger is Ranger Rick. And Ranger Rick is named in memory of a door gunner who was part of the crew of the helicopter where my husband was helicopter crew chief. And the dog is named in Rick's memory, and it obviously has quite meaning for him. The other dog is Major Magic. And notice that they both have military ranks. Major Magic is my dog, and she's female. And I felt, it also has very strong meaning, that Major was going to have a lot of magic if she was going to help cure our household of PTSD and autism spectrum disorder and everything else. But these dogs have been wonderful. But it isn't just the dog. It is the training of the dog and the working on your own relationship and your own need that has been particularly helpful as a household. And you've seen the information tables outside. It doesn't have to be a dog. It could be a cat. It could be a horse. But I would argue that a dog is particularly good and particularly effective because of the training and the hands-on work that one can do to work with one's own dog. Okay, I'm getting to the end, but I want to have some things to say. There aren't a whole lot of younger people here, but I want you to know that while there aren't lots of inpatient therapy programs or even weekly therapy sessions or monthly therapy sessions for family, at least now, millennials are being addressed by the VA and by other people with regard to information that is helpful for them. This is a website that's supplied by the VA with parenting tips, and I have one slide showing a double-edged sword, and they're talking about stress that comes from your children just because they're adolescents in this particular unit. But they're also talking about in the same presentation stress that a veteran with PTSD puts on the teenagers by having it. And it's very useful because, again, it looks at family dynamics. The nice thing about these kinds of things that are perhaps at times even more helpful than face-to-face therapy is that they're anonymous. If younger vets are still at the phase in their life where they don't want to show up for help and they think it'll have a negative effect on their job, or they're still in the military, it's nice that today you can get on the internet and you can get help for parenting and you can learn a whole lot of things simply by pointing and clicking around. There are whole books that are on the market for people with young children. This is one written by Seth Castle on why is Dad so mad? Now, not everybody with PTSD runs around mad all the time at kids, but at least there's a book written for very young children on explaining what's going on, as opposed to having a spouse of a veteran try to protect them and act like everything's okay. There are also websites for adult children of Vietnam veterans with PTSD, and already websites with adult children of Gulf War veterans. And they're on the internet and they're helping one another, and it's tremendous. So again, I want to say something about this because it's very meaningful to me personally. When we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder and its impact on the family, this isn't something that has 1 phase, 2 phase, 3 phase, 4 phase. My husband has a daughter who is now 48 years old. My husband is about to turn 68, and he was in Vietnam when she was conceived. And you can put whatever piece of story you want to put together with that, but the point of my mentioning it here is that they don't have the greatest relationship. Right now, they have an estranged relationship. 10 years ago, it was a pretty good relationship. Maybe if we live long enough, there'll be a relationship with it again. But these things change over time, not only as a veteran tries to deal with PTSD, but as an adult child tries to deal with what happened when she was a toddler and a little older and a little older and a little older. And, and there was no therapy at a time when it might have been particularly useful. It matters. It continues. I'm hoping, and I actually expect, that it will be different later on. This is a website that I found that I think is, again, particularly remarkable. It's developed by Google. Google has had an outreach program to hire vets, but they also have a series of lessons that are available by pointing and clicking that lists activities that young families and even older families can engage in to help the family deal with PTSD. Who would have thought? Google creating a website for families for PTSD? It was created originally for their own employees and those family members. But it's available to everybody. All you have to do is log on to Google and veterans.com families, and it's available. And the tools are wonderful. Some of them are things you might think of, like creating a map of where somebody served in military combat and creating a map that shows the locations where various members of the family were doing things at certain points in time. It includes the kind of activities that Ray mentioned, like journaling and drawing a picture. It talks about, literally creating a family map. So, what are the conclusions? What is it that I want to say? What can I tell you about families? Because I'm taking up a lot of time, and you folks have been so patient all afternoon, much more patient than I would be, because I'm not in the millennial generation, but I've watched it, and I do better with 2-minute sound bites than I do with listening to long talks. The point of what I've got to say is that the psychological processes associated with having experienced combat are likely to remain fairly constant. I mean, it's probably okay that it got in a diagnostic and statistical manual, although I agree with Ray that it's not a disorder, it's a normal response to a horrible situation. But the social context in which we experience these horrible symptoms are going to change, and they're going to change over time, and I don't know how they'll be in the next war. I wish I could say there isn't going to be a next war. But I do want to say something about the institutions and what has changed. Let's take a look at the family. Families changed tremendously since 1970. I mean, the military is now recognizing gay marriage. The military is recognizing single parenthood. The military is not doing anything about it, but it is recognizing and relying on the fact that sometimes grandparents raise grandchildren, especially when there's two combatants in the same family. So we have tremendous changes in the family, and that means there's a change in who's dealing with things. But we're not, even in our veteran service groups, really addressing these changes dramatically. I don't think I've ever seen an outreach program from any organization about, taking gay parents into consideration. And you might think that, well, why should we? But if we have them, then why shouldn't we? We have programs honoring Gold Star mothers, and we have lots of outreach programs for children who lose their parents in war. But we don't have programs for people who don't quite lose them. For the single mother whose son or daughter goes to war and is injured, we're not really reaching out to her because that's just not what we're doing. And I think we need to. And the other thing that we're not really recognizing, other than through the internet, is family isn't what family used to be. We are very dispersed. So a veteran can be living in Asheville, his son or daughter might be in Hawaii, and he might have another son or daughter who's in Philadelphia. So people are really spread out, so family can't really do the same kinds of things that they did before. They can't all gather around a military veteran because they're not in the same place. And if we also talk about spouses, we have very different kinds of family relationships with spouses. It used to be that we had a household, perhaps, more commonly, at least among middle-income people, where there was one wage earner and other people at home. Now we have a man and a woman, or two men or two women getting together who are somewhat emotionally dependent, but not necessarily economically dependent on one another because they have different incomes. And that's a very different situation. So if you're if you're a person with PTSD and you have a mate, you might want to take care of your spouse. But what does that mean? Does it mean providing money for that person? Does it mean providing a hug and a kiss? Does it mean providing an ear? These things are different, and so the family response is going to be different. Not being economically dependent on your spouse means you want something very different from your mate than people expected previously. Well, let's talk about the educational institution. When people came back from Vietnam and they thought about the educational institution, they often thought about hostile environments. It's why I had the slide of Kent State up there. But not anymore. On my campus and on the campus where Dr. Skerfield is associated, we have vet centers right on campus. We have outreach programs reaching out to help the veteran and to help a family member. At UNC Wilmington, they provide in-state tuition to a spouse whose husband was stationed at Camp Lejeune before deployment and after deployment, even if they're from Mississippi. I mean, if they're in Onslow County for a long enough period of time, they get in-state tuition. So we're doing things very differently, and and vet centers provide counseling and tutoring for vets. So the university isn't a hostile environment anymore. And now there are actually classrooms where there are tons of programs to help students, younger kids. So that's a positive thing, and that's the other reason why I say it's a little bit better. If we look at the medical institution and we move outside the VA, we have these emergency hotlines. We have suicide prevention programs. And yes, not in North Carolina, but elsewhere we have medical marijuana. And regardless of what your political attitude is toward medical marijuana, there is tons of research now out that medical marijuana actually helps people with PTSD symptoms. But it's not going to happen here anytime soon, even though one house of Congress has passed the fact that the VA can now talk about the benefits of medical marijuana. But it's not going to happen in North Carolina anytime soon. Economic institution, and I'm really almost done now, I promise. The military personnel are paid a lot better now than they were paid when people went to Vietnam. Relatively speaking, if you take a look at salaries of age mates and things like that, they're paid well if you compare their salaries to cops. They're paid well if you compare their salaries to first responders, and that's a good thing. But it's a negative thing also for families, because when someone exits the military, unless one is a retired person from the military, there's a tremendous drop in income, and that's very stressful for families. And even if you have a spouse that is not economically dependent on the mate, if people buy a house or people rent a home, it's usually based on, on an income higher than one has after one gets out of the military, and that's rather difficult. And moreover, we give lots of lip service to economic programs that say hire a vet, but because of that social divide, where non-military families know very little about military families, and people who work in HR departments are not necessarily likely to have lots of military friends. How much those economic programs of hire a vet are effective really varies tremendously. It's catch as catch can. There may be a great one in your community and one or two great companies, but there's really not a whole lot out there. Last and not least, because it should be not least, we have the political institution. And help for veterans and family members within locales is inconsistent, even within one city, like even within Asheville. It's not necessarily the same. Some have greater access, some have less access. And if you talk about the state of North Carolina, it varies tremendously. I live just outside of Wilmington, and we were very happy when we moved from a CBOC to a larger health setting. But most vets who live in the Wilmington area are still if they have private insurance, are still using it, and they're still going elsewhere outside of Wilmington in order to get help because a whole variety of services aren't available. And I don't mean to trash the VA because they're doing a lot of wonderful things. With regard to family therapy and family counseling, again, it's catch as catch can. We have two wonderful therapists treating PTSD at that Wilmington clinic. One goes out of his way, and he claims to bend the rules so he can see families. But he has to have a veteran in treatment, and the veteran has to report that there is a family problem that is affecting his symptoms of PTSD, and that's what the therapist literally has to write on a piece of paper in order to have a family counseling session. But they're doing it, and that's wonderful. And they're doing it, the spouse can actually call up and say, I think we need one of those family sessions. That's wonderful. But North Carolina, here, is a politically conservative state. People always ask me, is it a good state for veterans with PTSD? And is it a good state for families? I'm not going to trash North Carolina. I've lived here for more than 30 years. I am going to say that it's a good state for veterans because there are lots of veteran installations here. There are lots of retired veterans, there are lots of military bases, and it is still good to have a place where veterans are friendly to veterans. It's less friendly for families, although the National Guard units are doing wonderful job with the family support job, and I would say institutionally they're doing the best. Ideally, families need to be in an environment where the political climate generates services for all who need it. Right now, at this political point in time, this isn't a service-friendly environment. It might get friendlier in the future. That's up to you. I can't tell you how to vote, but I can sure tell you you'd better vote if you want the help that families need. Thank you. I too have to ask if there are questions. Anyone have a question? Yes.
Maybe just a comment. I've been a veteran service officer for 16 years. Surprisingly, most of the veterans I used to deal with PTSD didn't come in on their own. It was the wife that knocked on my door. Mr. Fowler, can I talk to you? She reached around the corner, bring her husband in by his shirt sleeve, tell him to sit down, and she'd stand up. And she'd stand up and say, Mr. Fowler, my husband's got this PTSD and he needs help. I had to learn really quick how to react to that type of entrance because the guy's sort of embarrassed. He's looking at his shoes. But over a period of time, you develop these ways of, breaking the ice and everything. But really, very few veterans come into me as a VSO and said, I need some help. I want to put in a claim for PTSD. Normally, which I was very grateful that the wife was at that point to where she couldn't take it. Basically says, look, because they tell me, she says, he's promised to come out to talk to you, many times. He never has. He keeps putting it off. So she literally drags them in. But it's worked out good, though. But she got engaged, and that's what's really important.
There are a lot of us who have done that, and sometimes it backfires. And I want to say something. It's a comment to that, but I think it's an important combat. Notice I said combat. That's a great Freudian slip. What I want to get across is that sometimes we do way too much. And there's a slippery slope there, because sometimes we belittle the person we love. And we make it harder rather than easier to try to tell a spouse that the spouse needs help. Might not be so effective as saying we need help. And I mean, the we is really important, because that's why I like that Sean Gurley's work, because she sees the dynamic that goes on with people saying the wrong thing, not intentionally. They don't know the right thing. Maybe it comes out in anger, and people feed off of one another. In my household, we have 3 people who have a short arousal span. Any one of the 3 of us can go to 0 to 10, with 2 or 3 sentences. And none of us want to do that. So if you can focus on the we, it's better. So the we need help, I think whether it's to a veteran service officer, or it's to a VA clinic, or it's to a suicide prevention line, it's really important. And I encourage spouses to ask for help. When my husband went on his own and submitted an application for a PTSD treatment program, he was on a waiting list. I mean, and he was eventually treated at the, at one of the VA hospitals. It doesn't matter which one it is really right now. But the point was, he was on a waiting list, and there were, he had to complete a questionnaire. And mea culpa, I called on the telephone and said, I'm this veteran's wife, and I believe my husband may be suicidal. And they said to me on the phone, well, by what reason do you think that? And I started listing a series of things that happened, and my husband was in the next treatment group. Sometimes you do have to go the extra mile, and when in doubt, act. But generally speaking, a we approach is more effective than you need help, because it's usually more complicated. Okay, I think we're done, and we're going to have, throw it open to discussion of everyone.
While we have Dr. Skirfield, you and Dr. Covan, Mr. Brett, and Dr. Scarano, if you would come up on stage so we can do a panel, that'd be great. While they're coming up to do the panel, is this thing on? Battery's dead. Can y'all hear me all right?
Yeah.
While they're coming up to do the panel, I would just like to make a plug for our agency. As y'all know, you have the resource guide out here, NC4 Vets. Please pick up a copy or 2 or 3. This has a lot of resources that are available to our veterans. A lot of it has to do with PTSD. Please note that, 5 years ago when a veteran come home, they were given something that looks like this, about like a Chinese menu, and they said, thank you very much. Our agencies went really fast-forwarded and produced this resource guide, all right? Another thing that our agency is doing is we're developing a program with Duke University to directly impact people like you, Mr. Fowler, who quite don't know how to deal with veterans when they come into the office, don't know how to ask the right questions. Being able to identify symptoms and symptomology of PTSD, and furthermore know how to map them to the people in the right areas and the right clinicians that are available. So we're rolling that out in September of this year, and we're going to be making that available to everyone in the community, not just our service officers. So with that being said, I think we're going to go to a panel discussion. I'll hand them about this one, Alan. Anybody have any questions for our panelists up here right now? Right here. Hang on, wait for the microphone there, ma'am.
I am very interested in PTSD because I have a grandson that has suffered from this. And so I have been doing a lot of research on what is causing mental problems. And omega-3 in hemp seed, which we have outlawed in this country, puts an end to mental problems. There is so much information if you go online. I know it sounds very simplistic, but hemp is known as the plant of renown that God gave us. And the Bible tells us all green seed-bearing plants are meant for food. So once we start eating hemp seeds every day, you'll feel as good as I. I am 82 and have been eating hemp seeds for 30 years. You'll feel fabulous. No, it's not inappropriate to speak the
I
truth.
totally agree with you. Hemp's great stuff. Any other questions here?
I believe there's some new research about doing pathology on brains, particularly people from Iraq and Afghanistan that suffered explosions, and there's new evidence of changes, early changes in people's brain, and there's relating that whether that could be a cause of PTSD rather than just concussions or psychological problems.
Bessel van de Kolk has done a lot of brain imaging things and does a lot of writing around it. This better? Okay. Do a lot of writing around that. And the fact with PTSD people, the hot spots in the brain sort of change. And they moves around, or one will get hotter. And he's done several books on it. And that's, he did his research in Boston General, I think. But it's just one of those things that is another thing that says, okay, PTSD has an impact and it's long term.
Another question?
Is it on? Yeah, I was wondering if you, any of you gentlemen, ladies, have any experience using cannabis or psilocybin mushrooms for PTSD?
There's a lot of research on cannabis. There's less research on psilocybin and mushrooms. It's much more anecdotal. And one of the reasons why is that when there's an illegal substance, a lot of the research funds that might come from the federal government or from corporations are not forthcoming. I mean, when we started to have legalized marijuana, and even for recreational use available, we also had many more research studies looking at what happened, and people were able to come out of the closet and be studied. And, you know, the business of these studies is important. I mean, you've heard Dr. Scurfield say sometimes a scientific study is a waste of money because by the time it's, well, you didn't say that. I'm putting those words in your mouth. I'm sorry. By the time a scientific study is done, we often know the answer. I mean, and when there's anecdote after anecdote after anecdote after anecdote that smoking a little pot or ingesting an edible form of THC relaxes someone, it's time to believe it. And we study it, and then we know, oh yeah, it's really true. People are more relaxed, and they're talking to one another. One of the good things about cannabis for relationships is that it gets people talking. I mean, and people start to be more open in conversation. That's a good thing, but we don't know what happens in any large enough sense with mushrooms. There are people who have worked with Native Americans who have been using mushrooms for years, who have a little more evidence, but it's still not at the scientific level. We just don't know.
We have some free samples for some cracked cannabis seeds that anybody here is welcome to avail themselves of and try if at the end.
Right in the back here. We'll get you, sir.
Good afternoon. I heard the last speaker say that there were support services for spouses of veterans. I want to know, is that support service at George VA Medical Center?
I'm having trouble hearing you.
She asked if it was at the VA Medical Center that's here, and none of us are from here.
I can sort of halfway answer that, Ed. There are, and Ed may be able to elaborate a little bit on this if we take the microphone to him. But I do know that there's an organization in Western North Carolina called NAMI, N-A-M-I, NAMI, and they do provide an excellent PTSD support group for spouses. And the last time I remember referring people there, which was about 1.5 years ago, those support groups were free. And they were through NAMI, N-A-M-I, in Western North Carolina. You can Google them and you can find out the contacts. But that would be a great place to start. With that being said, the Charles George VA does have support groups for spouses. It's not an ongoing treatment or ongoing program. They do have them periodically through the year. And Ed, if you want to elaborate on that a little bit, if you want, because he is from the Charles George VA Medical Center.
With that being said, the one thing that we do have in place is that we have our network of our social workers, whether it be primary care, mental health, or in various our services. And what I've come to understand, maybe not as much here in this area, but other places I've been, there are resources that our families can take advantage of, and our social workers will connect you with those resources for our families. They'll do this with due diligence and make sure that you can get connected. And as long as I'm at the VA, I'm going to champion for these things as well. So if there's anything specific that you have, real quickly, my name is Edward Moreno. My email, can I give out my email? Is edward.moreno3@va.gov. And I'll make sure that you get in contact with the right person. Again, our social workers, they do a fantastic job making sure our families get connected with sources outside of the VA as well as with sources within our own system. I hope that answered your question. Okay.
So I found it very difficult to just kind of meander through to the right
One of the
extension
things,
or the right person. when
I
you're
hear
not
what
a
you're
veteran.
saying. One of the things is, and it might be a better way to go through, is go to a vet center. They're much more open, and they can connect you with the right people. If it's not them, somebody else in the hospital. But it's easier to talk with them because it's sort of face-to-face, it's smaller, it's not the big monolith sitting there. So starting out at a vet center, it might be a very good alternate way of finding what you need.
Any more questions there?
I just want to make a comment about her question, because as an academician, I want to stress that the VA is not the only institution that can help you. There is a university in this area. We are at a community college here, and this is a vet-friendly community college. And University of North Carolina, Asheville is a vet-friendly campus. And you can seek information from those places as well. I don't know whether, if there is a vet center on campus, you don't have to be a student in order to walk in and say, I need some information, is there a group for it? So people, you need to look beyond the most obvious social institution for help, because it might be a totally different one where you're going to find it. Keep talking to one another and keep being your own advocates. I said before, a spouse, I think spouses today are in the same position that Vietnam veterans were in when they started the VVA. I mean, you need to be your own advocates and to create things. Now, I'm not a therapist, and I never want to be one because I wouldn't be very good at it. I'd take on everybody's symptoms, and that's what happened to me when I tried. But in Wilmington, there was no program for spouses offered by the VA. And one of the therapists at the VA said, would you help me organize a family support group? And he wanted me to run a group for wives of veterans who were getting therapy from him. And I tried it, and we did it for a while, but it backfired. I mean, the women knew one another too well, and some of us knew some of the problems that others' husbands were experiencing, and we were not the right ones to be running a group. So, but the fact that there are a lot of groups that are sort of emerging where women are trying to help one another is a good thing, because eventually it will become institutionalized. It's not the answer you want, but you may have to create it, is what I'm trying to say.
I'd like to pose a question. Let's talk about startled response. I have a severe case of startled response. Sitting in a restaurant and someone takes a spoon and taps a glass, I go berserk. It's from one extreme to the other. So who's the expert?
I'm just, well, I can't hear this. You're asking a question in reference to a startle response? I mean, when you say a startle response, do these startle responses occur in multiple settings, or does it only occur in restaurants or places in public? Pardon?
Anywhere, he said, Tom.
Anywhere? You know, again, there's multiple reasons why, what precipitates startle responses. It can be could be something symbolic. It could be something actually, it could be something related to smell, taste, any of the senses. Those can all stimulate startle responses. What's the effective treatment of startle responses? Some people, again, often want to use certain medications. That's not my approach to it. My approach to treating startle responses to begin to identify, certain areas that they occur. Secondly, is that when they occur, is there something that you can do to intervene to actually reduce the impact of the startle response? By that I mean, is there a corresponding cognitive thought that goes, like, do you have a cognitive thought that comes when you have a startle response? Is there a corresponding thought? Yeah.
I really can't answer that. It comes from nowhere at different times.
So it's just random, basically. Has there been anything ever that's helped you with these startle responses? Something that you've done, either accidentally or attempted to diminish it?
You can try to ignore it, but it could come back at any time.
Yeah, and is there a theme to it? Is it pretty, no, so I assume there's a physiological reaction associated with it also. Like you feel a increase in your heart rate, do you feel?
Oh goodness, yes. And once it's over, you're exhausted. You're tired, you're exhausted, you're mentally fatigued. That's the severity of the startle response.
It's a flight-fright,
Yeah,
reaction.
right, which is a physiological. Yeah, so, and one of the things that might help is that when you begin to have them, to interrupt them, to try to take deep breaths, like holding, taking in a deep breath and counting 1,001, 1,002, 1,003, and then exhaling, and consistently do that. that also would help the, the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide, so it might physiologically diminish the impact of the startle response. Because what we're trying to do is basically trying to reduce the physiological aspect of the startle response. So taking a deep breath and holding it like this, and people, if you're around people, they can't see what you're doing. They don't know that you're taking a deep breath and counting to yourself slowly, 1,001, 1,002, 1,003, and then exhaling. That may help, at least give you, what it will do is give you a sense of control. And that's what we're looking for, that you can get a sense that you can control these. So any kind of intervention that you do, from deep breathing to trying to create some visual imagery of relaxation when you have them, anything that will give you a sense that you can control them. And eventually, hopefully that will evolve, that you will be able to control them.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Here first, I think, man over here in the blue shirt. Oh, he answered it?
Oh, no, I don't mind saying
Any more questions? Questions?
Here we go.
I'm wondering if any of you are aware of like biofeedback for this sort of thing. I have all my life had seizures, and I've lived in the state of Washington, and I have a license to use cannabis for my seizures. The reason that they said I had these seizures was that I had hyperactive brain waves. So what cannabis does is slow down your brain waves and put your brain waves in an alpha state, which is an experience of more peace. Certainly veterans are suffering from post-traumatic stress from being in wars. Do they not deserve to use God's plants to have alpha brain waves? I mean, if we follow the Bible, we will use all the plants for healing.
What's the question, ma'am?
Well, the question is, any of you doctors, are you studying the brain waves of the people with this? Because the brainwave studies are fairly new, but they will really show you the difference between beta brainwaves, which is stress and worry, or alpha brainwaves. And you can do this with biofeedback and meditation and breathing. But if we're not aware that we have beta brainwaves, and we're angry and attacking and taking all kinds of drugs, we are a detriment to the world.
So your question is, do they know any research on this? That's your question?
The essential question is, are you studying the brainwaves so that we could help the PTSD issue?
When you're in an outpatient clinic, it's really hard to have the machinery to do what you're suggesting. Many of the hospitals have the machine. Do they do brainwaves? Maybe. But it doesn't fold into outpatient treatment.
At this moment, but if you become aware, that's why I'm here, to help you become aware that this could be a help, because don't you think everyone should be able to have alpha brainwaves and be at peace?
It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen.
I believe it will, because that's God's will for us.
It will
Thank
not
you.
happen.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any more questions? Mr. Morano?
I've had some personal success on something that I thought was kind of a hocus pocus, but your thoughts on grounding, actually physically grounding yourself, that's something that was shared with me, and it's something I put into practice, and I do it daily now, and it seems to have helped me be in a better place. So I'd like to know what your thoughts are on that, if you have any.
I've used rocks as a tool, and it's easy to carry. Little, mostly plain down rocks, just so they can feel it, and it helps stay grounding. Some people you will use tapping on their wrist or on their forehead, and for the same effect. I've had people grab. I had one person in a group start to really disassociate, and I had to grab the bottom of her seat and just pull her butt down. And she came back and ended up being grounded. I mean, there's lots of things.
Thank you. The reason I wanted to bring it up, because as silly as those things might sound, I'm finding more and more people actually benefit from some of these things, and I just appreciate you sharing that, because I'm starting to hear more and more people have these conversations of things that actually help mitigate when the episodes do happen. So instead of being at a 10, they're at a 6 or 7, which makes you be able to come back down without that exhaustion being so excessive. But everybody's different, so thank you. I like the chair one. I'm going to try that one.
And I've used biofeedback a lot, and using not only the stimulation, the temperature, and I can't remember the last one, but all three machines, and being able to monitor that where they can start to get control. It might be also something that might work for panic attacks.
I'd like, are we on? Hello? Yeah, I'd like to ask a question. Since 3 of the 4 on that panel were involved in 1980 with the Vet Center program and the onset of diagnosis of PTSD, and this is 2016, it's 36 years later, and I'd like those individuals to reflect on, in terms of lessons learned, you know, because we've all been part of that, in terms of where we are today and what we've learned in these 36 years that can help the older generation in terms of dealing with the stage of their life, and the younger population as they're trying to, you know, get on with their lives, and the impact it has on the family. So can the 3 panelists that were part of this 1980 revolution within the system of the VA talk about?
You know what I would like to hear? The VA asked that very same question. They might learn some things that might help them.
But I'd like your comments, because, you know, Ray is still involved in private practice and consults with the Vet Center. You know, Tom still is involved in private practice, and you do a lot of consulting, Alan. So, I mean, for a lot of individuals, you know, 1980 was an important year because it kind of transformed the Vietnam population into trying to start to get care. So can you comment on that?
Yeah, remember, the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder was initially in a DSM-3R. And then, remember, the DSM-3 and then moving to the DSM-4, it's a criterion reference way of making a diagnosis, which means it's constantly changing. So to ask me, I say that the diagnosis of PTSD has become much more sophisticated. Initially, it was a plethora of symptoms which a lot of them I disagreed with, some of them I agreed with. But as time goes on, the diagnosis is going to be more and more clear, which is going to help clinicians being able to focus on certain symptomology associated with PTSD. Look at DSM-5, which has more some different criteria than DSM-4R had, and I think and that's based on more and more research associated with PTSD. Remember, the more information we have, the more research that is conducted, the better we'll be able to make the diagnosis, which again, the betterment of knowing, of assisting in treatment, because we'll have a good sense or a better sense of the symptoms that are associated with PTSD. So it's evolving, it's going to evolve, you know, as many, I've treating many Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. Their symptoms are a little different than many of the Vietnam veterans. Part of it is, I think, what she talked about, the age process, and the symptoms manifested by Vietnam veterans today is a little different than, not a little, different than they were 15 or 20 years ago. And you look at many of the Afghanistan and Iraqi veterans, so many of their symptoms are somewhat similar but different than many of the symptoms that we as veterans manifested in our 20s and 30s. So it's evolving, which is excellent, that the whole DSM-5 will, you know, is much better than the DSM-4R, 4, and 3. I don't, Ray, you.
Actually, I just wanted to say something. I agree totally. I wanted to add a different dimension to the question. In 1980, even though it was established as a diagnosis, many clinicians did not believe in the diagnosis in 1980, did not believe in it through the 80s, particularly psychiatry. And quite frankly, I think psychiatry is coming on board because they're finding some biologic markers. And so now they can, you know, say, hey, you know, it's got biologic markers to it. Oh, that's just a piece of it. But to me, the fact that it's been accepted now, and that, of course, in 1980, the primary impetus for PTSD came from two groups, sexual assault and rape advocates and Vietnam veterans. And now it encompasses a much wider area, including natural disasters and so forth. And so that, to me, that is good. But the downside is a lot of people are getting labeled as disordered, to me, that are not disordered. I don't know still how well it does in separating out where the line is between disorder and normal and expectable. And I think we still have a dichotomous decision-making. You either have it or you don't. Another way to go is you have a continuum, and you make a decision on that continuum. We don't have that kind of diagnostic process in place yet. I would push towards that.
Yeah, and something just related to continuum I push for too is that I think there's a much different set of symptoms associated with an acute trauma compared to a protracted trauma. I think people who have been multiple exposures to trauma look much different than somebody who's had an acute trauma.
Well, there's something else going on here now, too, and that's that the diagnosis is associated with money. And there are people who want the diagnosis, and it is a continuum in terms of how serious your symptoms are, but it's not a constant even once one gets the diagnosis. I mean, we talked about the fact that PTSD is a chronic disease, but it's episodic, and it goes from being mild to moderate to severe in the same individual and possibly back again at different times in the life course. But if, you know, the medical institution combined with the economic institution assigns a number, they call it a GAF score, and it has to do with whether or not you're employable and how disabled you are, and your compensation is connected to that GAF score. And until we somehow put social institutions together and try to provide help without the economic label at the same time, it's going to be hard to figure out exactly where we are, because the GAF score assumes you're not necessarily going to get better.
Want to hear a surprise?
Yes.
The VA doesn't use GAF scores anymore.
Well, that's good. I'm sorry.
They don't.
They don't.
They've moved away from that, and a combination of other instruments to help come up.
So then I stand corrected. What do they use to link order, disorder,
Social
and
impairment.
Well, the
panic
GAF score is
attacks,
about
anxiety.
the intensity, about is this guy off the chart, or is he
I can speak
functioning
on that.
some?
I can speak on that, Alan.
Good.
If you go from a 30% to a 50% rating for PTSD, one of the criteria out of the 38 CFR and on the rating table is used is the number of panic attacks you have weekly. And that's self-reported, right?
Yeah.
But that's one of the tools that they use to go from 30 to 50%. It's very gray.
It's very gray if it's all based on self-report. If
No,
it were based on,
They use, at least here, they use testing and interview. Does the testing, like the MMPI, doesn't tell you how bad he is. It might say he has this, but it doesn't say anything about how bad. And they want to know how bad it is, where they're going to give you a 30% or 100%.
so they're not asking forgive me, us. They're not asking the folks who are living with the veteran how bad it is.
But they could.
Well, you can submit a letter in support of,
Yes.
but you're, from their perspective, you're irrelevant.
Yes, that's exactly my point.
Because it's about the veteran, and it's isolated, it's encapsulated.
But the support is not just about the veteran, because the veteran gets a little more if he or she has one of us and several little ones, or even an adult child who's with a disability who was disabled prior to the age of 18, but nobody's asking us, how bad is this person?
We got away from the original question.
True.
That,
But it hit a nerve.
and it does for many spouses. Could you state the question?
I just wanted, just one other point is that one thing we haven't talked about at all is that insurance companies are driving there to be more and more and more people getting diagnoses, because basically you don't get reimbursed as the provider typically unless the person you're seeing reaches the criteria for a diagnosis. And so a lot of people then are going to be getting, for example, PTSD diagnoses who you might otherwise not think they should have a PTSD diagnosis or depression diagnosis or anything else, because you won't get paid. And so there's an inflation in my mind about people's who are getting psychiatric diagnoses to begin with, including PTSD. So the validity of the diagnosing to me is becoming questionable. In any case, I wonder if we need to be closing up, and we'll still be around if anyone wants to ask us any more questions, so people can.
All right, thank you very much. Like I said, they'll be around a little bit afterward if you want to talk to them offline. They'll stick around for a little bit longer. Other than that, we appreciate everybody coming out. Y'all enjoy the rest of your Saturday, and thank you for coming.